Okay, welcome to the Node.js and Oracle Database Office Hours for March 2019. My name is Christopher Jones, and we have here on the call as well Dan McGann, the evangelist for JavaScript and Oracle Database, Blaine Carter, who's also an evangelist in the open source scripting world, and Anthony Tuaninga, who's really one of the key developers, or the key developer there in the driver land. Certainly started the Python CX Oracle driver and is really doing a lot with the note-oracledb driver as well at the moment. Those are our Twitter handles. For those not familiar with office hours, I think you probably all are. You can kind of jump in, you can type or talk by unmuting yourselves, chatting generally with us. We do have an icebreaker theme. We try and keep it pretty brief, each session pretty brief. Icebreaker theme this month is going to be Dan's just previewing some stuff he's working on LOBs, long objects, and then we'll just throw it over to any questions if you do have any at the end, and then we'll call it a day whenever we're ready to quit. So we ran through this last month, but this is just the basic stack that we have here for note-oracledb, just to remind people of the various layers of the code and where the changes come in. And I will talk about one thing before we throw over to Dan, and that is that we are kind of working on note-oracledb version 4. And we are calling it 4 because we're actually changing the layer of the underlying API to talk to Node.js. And we're going to swap to something they call n-API, which is now a generic layer in Node.js for drivers like ours, binary drivers like ours. Previously, we were using a wrapper called NAN, N-A-N, and which is kind of getting more obsolete. So we're swapping over to n-API, which is why we're really going to have to go to a version 4 of note-oracledb, because we're kind of making all these changes and realizing maybe a little bit of instability and at the start. So we don't want you to suddenly just think, oh, everything's going to be easy if we upgrade to a 3.2. So Anthony's been working hard on that layer of code, n-API. He's found particularly one major performance issue with the n-API layer itself in Node.js, and so there's a patch ready to be merged. I didn't check it today, but they're going to merge that in. So functionally, we kind of think we're okay with this. We've been doing various stress testing and things like that. It kind of looks roughly okay. We're not 100% sure that we're going to go with it and ship with it, but it's looking better and better. The proviso will be that you'll get a slightly worse performance for using larger objects unless you have one of these patch versions of Node, which obviously don't exist yet. So it'll be a sort of 8.something, 12.something when they come out, we'll have those patches. So everything should work with 8 onwards, as we talked about previously, but you won't get the exact same performance unless using the latest of those releases. So that's something we do want feedback on is, is that okay? Are you acceptable with, is that okay? Because obviously we want to get to n-API sooner rather than later, because that's just the way to go. And obviously if you have one of those older versions, then you can always use an older version of note-oracledb as well. So you kind of do have multiple choices there, but just let us know what you feel about that. Are you okay with us shipping with n-API support, which is hidden, you won't notice, except performance may be a little slower if using long objects, unless you have one of those latest, greatest versions of Node.js. Let us know. And with that, it's over to Dan to speak about long objects.
Cool, thanks, Chris. And just a reminder for the folks here today, if you have any questions, you're technically muted right now, but feel free to use the chat feature and just let me know if I'm not explaining something well enough, and I'll be happy to go into any more detail as necessary. So back in 2015, in March of 2015, I wrote a blog post called Throttled File Loading with Node.js and Oracle Database. And I reviewed this recently, and I have to admit I was kind of embarrassed. At this time, the Node.js driver for Oracle Database, note-oracledb, was only 2 months old. And so it was fairly young and naive. It did not have support for LOBs, either streaming or buffered. And I really wanted to somehow get LOBs into the database. And when I went back and looked at this and saw what it took, I was kind of shocked that I shared that with the world and kind of expected them to do what I had cooked up. But luckily, a lot's changed since then. Over the last 4 years, of course, we've gotten a lot of new features. And the most important for this post are the features related to LOB support. So both blob and clob support is now in, and that means both streaming APIs as well as buffered APIs. And I'll explain a bit about what I mean by buffered here in just a moment. Also, there's a nice feature now in Node itself, really JavaScript, and it's known as async iterators. And what I'm doing is essentially a rehash of this post, only now I'm going to do it in 3 different ways. I'm going to demonstrate that you can do this using buffered APIs. The buffered APIs are the best in terms of simplicity, but what that means is as you're moving a file from a client, from the browser to the database with Node in the middle, you're basically going to materialize that file entirely in Node.js before transferring it to the database. Or if you're moving it from the database through Node to the client, then you're going to buffer it entirely again from the database and into Node. And so that's just something to be aware of. So for example, if your Node.js process had 1 gig of memory available to it, and the file you're trying to move was 2 gigabytes, well, the buffered approach is simply not going to work for you. You're going to have to move to one of these streaming approaches here. The benefit of the buffered approach is simply the code base. In terms of what you have to write, it's pretty darn simple. So these other APIs, I would just recommend if you have a lot of concurrent users, large file sizes, that kind of stuff, it may be necessary to scale that up some. All right, so let's take a look here. Where should I start? Let's go into the SQL scripts directory first, and we'll just look at this file. So the only thing I really need is a table. I'm calling it JSAO files, just so I wouldn't overwrite anyone else's tables. But you see we have a primary key, we have a file name and content type. This is your MIME type, generally speaking. And so this is metadata about the file, and this is the actual file content itself. We're just going to put that into a table. There are all kinds of reasons you might want to do this, such as utilizing the same backup and restoration procedures that you have in place for your database, as opposed to what you may need to do if you were using the file system for something like this. But there's also Oracle text, which is a really nice feature of the database. I hope to build on these demos here in the future and show what we can do with other features in the database, such as Oracle text as well. But that's all I really need to store the file. And I'll go into the buffering app, and I'm going to start this up. Now, if you look at the file structure here, and that looks familiar, there's a reason for that. I did a series before on my blog. Just got to remember how to type. And it's here, this series, and I described the file structure, I believe, in the first part here. So if you're curious, want to learn more about the file structure and how I put it together, start with that series. But what I did, I just copied basically the finished product from that series and then just modified a few files to not work with employee data, but rather files. So what we have in the index.js brings in a web server, which is under services. And if I show you that web server, you'll see what I'm doing here. Let's open that up, actually. I'm using the Express static middleware. This is now built into Express. You don't have to bring it in as a separate module. And I'm mounting at the, well, not mounting, rather, I'm pointing the static middleware to go up one directory and then into the www. So if we go up one into www, this is my front end application. You can see it's pretty darn simple. The HTML has some content that looks like this. We can open that up to, oops, need to do it from here. Pretty simple. This is just a basic Bootstrap application. I didn't use any JavaScript MVC framework like React or Vue or anything like that. So kept it really vanilla. If you want, it should be fairly easy to convert into any library you are using. But you can see I'm bringing in jQuery, I'm bringing in Popper for tooltips, I'm bringing in Bootstrap, and finally I'm bringing in the async library, which runs in both Node or in the browser. It's a really great library for working with complex asynchronous operations. So it's the JavaScript file here that does all the heavy lifting, and the most important part is this handle upload click function. And before I go any further, it may behoove me to do a quick demo. So I'm going to start up the buffered implementation and point my browser to localhost port 3000. And you'll see I'm looking at the app now. And so the basic idea is I'm going to select some files. I'm in my screenshots directory, and I'm sorted by size, selecting some of the bigger screenshots I have. So these are files now that I'm looking at here on the client side, and I want to upload them into my database. So I click this upload button, and we can see the progress of the files. Now they're all in the database, and we can see those reflected in the second region down here at the bottom. There's also download buttons, so I can download those back and view them if I want, but I'll just go ahead and delete them all. So that's the app, and what we're looking at now is sort of how that was put together. So this JavaScript file here on the client side in the app, when I click that upload button here, this is the function that was invoked. And so what I do, I find the file selector here, and I'm able to access a property called files, which is the array of selected files. And then I use that async library I was telling you about. It has an each limit function, and I can say, all right, for each element in this array, for each file I want to upload, go ahead and process this many at a time, and that number is currently set to 3. And then invoke for each file this upload file function, which you can see is defined just below. And when all the files are finished uploading, invoke the reset function. So it's this upload file that does the heavy lifting. You can tell it takes in the file that needs to be uploaded, creates a new XML HTTP request object, and then uses some of the methods in here. So I open a post on the endpoint API file. So I'm doing a post to that endpoint. I'm setting a couple request headers. And the reason for this, so XML, the XHR object now, version 2, and most modern web browsers supports streaming a blob natively by default. And you can see that down below. At the very end, I'm going to call send, and I'm just going to send that file that was passed in. So that's the native blob support. Don't have to do a lot of work for that. That's great. But of course, the file content itself is not enough. I also need to know the name of the file, perhaps the type of the file. So I'm accessing those properties here and sending those in the request as HTTP headers. All right, so I send the metadata as well as the content. And now on load, I have 2 different branches here. So if we get a 201 success, that means we're done. And if not, we probably have an error. So I'll go ahead and display the error inside the UI as well. On progress, this is a nice little event we have. I can update, and you may have noticed the little progress indicators it's showing. We're uploading relatively small files, so it may not have shown very long, but you can update that for larger files especially, which is nice. So that's the front end of the application. Any questions so far? I think we're good. All right, let's dive in to the Node.js portion. So I'm going to go into controllers and open up files.js. Actually, I should have started one step back, and I'll start in the web server. So in the web server, I already showed you that I'm using the static middleware to host my front-end application. But another important part is here where I'm mounting at /API, I'm mounting the router. And if you remember that post from before, we're doing a post against API files. So this is where I'm doing that. Here's a /API. I'm bringing in the router, and the router is defined here. We just have 2 different endpoints. One includes one's for actually working with the files, and the other is the file content. This one here is specifically for that download feature you saw in the UI, but most of the, like the post, for example, is happening here. So this is actually how we're going to move the file up and into the database. So for that, we get into the controller logic. You can see that here, controller for files. So I'm now in the controllers directory, and we'll open the files file, and you can see the post function here. So now what happens in Node.js when we're passed a request object by the web server, by default, this request object is an instance of a readable stream. And so like a readable stream, you can use anywhere in Node, we have this event called data, then we can add an event listener. And the idea is now as the file is coming across, it's coming across in chunks. It's not being buffered by Node, but what I'm doing is taking each chunk and I'm pushing it into an array that I've named content buffer. So technically, I'm actually doing the buffering. And that's fine, as I said, for smaller files, less concurrency. but something to keep in mind as you want to scale that up. You'll want to switch to streaming completely. So I push it into the content buffer, and then skipping ahead, when I get the end event, now I know that all the data is in that buffer array. So I take the buffer array and I pass it to buffer concat, which just basically takes it from an array into a single buffer object. And then I can pass that along to the database API and its create method here. And I'm passing, you'll notice I'm getting the file name and the content type from those HTTP headers from the request. And I'm passing all three, the two pieces of metadata along with the entire file that's now materialized in Node.js along to the database API. So that database API is here. And here's our create method. So the create method is taking the file name, content type, and the content buffer. And it's simply defining a binds object, passing along those values. And then I use my simple execute to execute this create SQL. And you can see the bind values here. These names align with these binds here. And that's all it takes. And this is thanks to the beautiful work that Anthony has done, adding support to just be able to pass along this content buffer and not have to use the streaming APIs, which was actually the first option that we got when we started working with LOBs in note-oracledb. So that is it in a nutshell, getting the file up and into the database. We can do the reverse, come down here and look at downloading. So there's this file content method. And the idea is we're going from the database now back to the client. And so in order to do that, I have a simple select. And I'm just using the fetch info, which has been available to us for a while. But I'm saying that blob data here, that column, should be fetched as a buffer. So go ahead and buffer that up into Node.js memory and then pass it along to me to work with. Going back to the controller, the download here is fairly simple. I just invoke that database API to get the rows, and then I can access the blob data. It's that already buffered data, and I can send that out. There's support in Node.js to send that out directly, and it'll just stream that then on out to the client. Of course, you just need a few headers to indicate to the browser that this is in fact a download, like this content disposition here. You can tell it the length so it can show progress indicators on the other side and so on. So that is, in a nutshell, uploading and downloading files using this buffered technique. And my hope is to finish the implementation with the other two options, using iteration, async iterators and the transform stream. Transform streams and Node have been around for a while. The async iterators are newer. At the end of the day, they're both going to end up using the streaming API for LOBs in Node.js and the database driver. The difference is just in the approach. And so I'll do both and maybe let folks know when I'm done which one I like better. I think it's going to be easier to maintain, but I wanted to touch base on both of those. So hopefully I'll have this out soon, and folks can get started working with LOBs in their own applications. But that's all I got for you for now. Any questions? And by the way, the questions don't have to be specifically related to blobs, uploads, downloads, that kind of stuff. If you have any questions at all with respect to Node.js and Oracle database, we're happy to take those and get your questions answered. No questions?
It's all perfectly clear, Dan.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I'm sure there were many points I could have been interrupted or told to explain better. Cool. Well, this will be a rather short call if we don't get any questions. We'll leave it open for maybe another minute and go ahead and shut down after that. Question came in whether timeouts are set for the execution of blob columns commands in the database. Timeouts are set. So I'm not sure if I understand completely, Anthony. I'm not sure if you maybe get that one. I'm not, but
Yeah, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Actually, I'm going to answer the second question. The question is this blogged anywhere? And the answer is, I think that was about Dan's blob stuff. And the answer is he's working on the blog. So that will come out in future and he'll extend that.
Whatever you do, don't read the old blog post. It's terrible.
So that's the quick answer to that second question. The first question was about whether timeouts are set for the execution of blob commands. So there are various timeout controls in Oracle land. Traditionally, they have all been set via the SQLnet.ora file options. And there's a whole bunch of things like receive timeout and send timeouts and what have you. A couple of those are documented in the Node API manual with various links. So then you can jump into the Oracle network, the SQLnet manual, and find all the other options that you can set. And they are fairly what I would call heavy-handed because they're just set once per application or once per process, I guess. And so they affect everything which goes across from that application to the database, and there are connect timeouts and all sorts of things, as well as packet timeouts. What we did in Node 3. Something, was that 3.1 or 3.0? I forget when that came out, but with Anthony's opened his mouth here, I think he's checking. Recently, anyway, in one of the 3.x series, we added support for an Oracle database 18C call timeout option. So we exposed some of those, or one of those SQLnet options, which you used to have to set in a configuration file. We exposed that through a Oracle DB call timeout and an execution call timeout setting.
If I read into the question a little bit, I'm assuming it would be something along the lines of, let's say we're buffering a 2 gig file into memory, and then we're calling, insert with the driver and basically expecting it to transfer all that data from Node to the database. Will that time out? Okay, exactly. Excellent.
Yeah, so the timeout I'm talking about, the call timeout, should handle that case as well, because it's all traffic to the database. Excellent. There are some provisos. We blogged about that. I think we may even have discussed it. We did in previous recordings. And there's a little bit of talk about that in the manual about how it actually works and how it's sort of more per trip request across to the database rather than an end-to-end sum of times. But for most parts, it will do exactly what you want.
Yeah, and that is version 3.0.
3.0. So you need 3.0 and you need Oracle 18C client libraries for that particular command. And if you don't have those two, then you have to fall back to the older methods, which are configuring options in a SQLnet.ora file and configuring nodes so that it knows where to find that when it starts. And all of that is in the API MD, the Node-OracleDB manual.
Yeah. Some of the things I didn't go into a lot of detail, but let me just share really quickly the files again. So in this controller logic, I kind of wanted to put in a couple pieces or requirements to show you how you could implement your own. So one of those requirements was that the max file size should be just 50 megabytes. And so what I'm doing as I get my chunks, in addition to pushing those into my array, I'm also keeping track of the total number of bytes I have in that array, total number of bytes in the file. And then if we exceed that max file size, I can go ahead and kill the connection. And another one is aborted. And so basically if I start an upload and it's a large file from the client to Node, and I just say refresh the browser, right? Essentially what I'm doing is canceling that XHR request, and I can detect that event here and handle it as needed. So I built in some of that logic. I would think if you did have a very large file, you might want to either take an approach like this or go ahead and switch to the streaming APIs. So then, each call is going to be a smaller chunk and it'd be a bit more manageable than trying to move something really large all at once. And we'll cover that in the future. Some of the complexity, though, I like to separate logic from my controller and my database API. The idea there is that the controller logic it's going to have access to the HTTP request and response objects, but the database logic should not know anything about the request and response objects, right? So the question is, when you talk about streaming a file, and this is where things get a little complicated, I need to get a handle on a LOB in the database, and then I need to stream from the controller logic to the database logic chunk by chunk as I'm streaming it through. And so that'll be really interesting to write about, and where the transform streams and the async iterators can be a lot of fun to tie these two somewhat distinct parts of your app together.
One other thing that's worth noting as well, this approach, the maximum is 1 gigabyte currently.
Oh,
you cannot go beyond that, even if you've got terabytes of RAM.
good to know.
Yeah.
All right.
And the maximum in that case, the limit is coming in the note-oracledb layer. Effectively, that's where that limit comes in.
Nope, that's OCI.
Well, yeah, I know, but it's from the.
Oh, yeah.
Even I know that.
Oh, okay.
That's implementation beneath us, but that's not in the front end. It's not in the back end, in the mid tier, which is the Node.js.
Right. Yeah.
Note-oracledb layer. But the streaming method does not have that size limitation.
Exactly. Yeah. If it weren't for the additional complexity in tying these layers together behind a streams implementation, I would just argue go for that. But when I compare the simplicity for this buffering approach, it's just a lot easier with buffered APIs. So thank you, Anthony. I appreciate them.
No problem.
Cool. Well, I don't see any other questions in the queue. So I think we'll go ahead and call it a day here. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and we hope to see you next month. I hope, by the way, to have at least one of the 2 streaming implementations done then, and I'll go ahead and talk about it at that time.
And we did mention we may change the time slot next month just to see if we can be nicer to a few other people around the world. So keep an eye on the advertisements to see what time it actually is.
Fair enough. We may be shooting, just in case you're interested, we may be shooting for 10 a.m. Eastern, I believe.
Eastern American time.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks. All right, everybody. Thanks again for joining. Take care.
All right. Yep.